Welcome to Epic Conversations. I'm Diane, and we're here today with my special guest, David. And David's a very good friend of mine. His wife, Lesley, designed this set, and so they make a good team. So today we're going to talk about expectations and reality.
Yes.
And you've got a revelation on this, so why don't you share that with our audience, David?
I'm not sure if I would call it a revelation as much as a lot of experience.
Okay.
Of expecting one thing and the reality was different. It happens in life, it happens at home, it happens at work. You know, I can expect Lesley would do this thing, she does that thing, she would expect I would do this thing, I do that thing. It happens all the time. The issue becomes when you don't meet them where the reality is and possibly try and move them to where the expectation is. And I always go back to the age of 15.
Okay.
I'm taking driver's ed in school, and my dad takes me out for my first time behind the wheel. And I've been watching, I'm a watcher, so I've been watching mom and dad drive, you know, for weeks, for months, for years. And my expectation is that I'm going to get behind the wheel, you know, arm up there, you know, 65 miles an hour, you know, no cares. I know how to do this. So we go out on this dirt road. Dad gets out of the driver's seat. I climb in the seat. My mom had a 64.5 Mustang with a 3-speed on the floor. And I had an expectation of how I was going to drive. So I get in there, you know, this is before we had seat belts. Get in there, get everything adjusted, push in the clutch, put in first gear, and Dad said, okay, let's go, let out the clutch. I started letting out the clutch, pushing on the gas, and pretty soon I'm driving down the road, shifting gears. I'm in third gear. And I remember I'm driving along, you know, 10 and 2, that's what you're taught back then, 10 and 2, and you're with the parents, so you are gonna follow the law. And I remember, you know, driving along there, and pretty soon Dad said, you know, son, you can go a little faster. And I'm like, without even looking at him, because you're watching the road, no, I'm good. And I remember later on thinking about that. My expectation was, you know, one hand on the wheel, the other on the gear shift, 65, 70 miles an hour, no problem. The reality was, it was a little scarier than I thought. And Dad didn't say, well, son, you talked about doing this. No, he just said, okay, well, when you're comfortable. And
that's good.
So I don't know how long after I got my driver's license before I got my first speeding ticket. So I got comfortable pretty quick. But the reality was, even the expectations of myself didn't match up with reality. And so whether it's a coworker, whether it's your spouse, whether it's one of your kids, is when you find out what the reality is, you have to decide, is the reality a good place to stay, or do you want to move them to the expectation? And if you want to move them, then you have to be willing to get down to their reality and work with them and teach them. You know, Jesus was a teacher. You know, there was expectations. The Jews and the Pharisees had an expectation of what Jesus would look like, how he would act. You know, he'd come, you know, hand on the steering wheel. The reality was, Jesus came and just loved on people. So the problem became the Pharisees and the Jews weren't willing to come down to the reality. They stayed in their expectations, and as such, they never accepted Jesus because he didn't live up to their expectations.
But the religious expectations they had. Like,
you know, of what he would look like. Instead, they stayed there where the reality was right here, where there was peace and there was comfort. And as we know in Revelations, the expectations they had will come to pass at some point in time, where he will come and establish a new kingdom. But they wanted the expectation now.
They wanted an earthly kingdom.
Yes.
And he wasn't speaking of an earthly kingdom.
Right. So the fact is, if you're really going to love people, and not just your family, if you're really going to love people, maybe people you've hired to work for you, you have to be willing to set the expectation of what you expect out of them, but be willing to come down to the reality and then walk them to the expectation.
That's good. Walking them to that expectation. I remember when we were in Charis together, there was one of the speakers was sharing about, and he used the example of a pastor of a church. He said that he set his expectations high, and so when he, by faith, so he would by faith see his people at a certain level, not broken, sick and poor and all that, but he'd see them victorious. He'd see them full of faith and growing in the Lord. And so in his mind, he had this expectation that that's where they're going to be. And what happens is, as the leader, the people rose to that expectation, to that vision that the leader or the pastor had in their heart.
Yeah.
And that was, I always remembered that. I don't remember who said it, but I remembered that example. It was just very awesome. Thank you.
My pleasure. We just have to remember every one of us has an expectation of ourselves, of our spouse, of our employees, of our friends. We have an expectation, and more often than not, our expectations are going to not be met. And we have to decide, okay, do we need that high of expectation? But secondly, how do you communicate now to get them to understand and the vision behind your expectation? And it's one of these numbers. You're always kind of trying to maneuver. You run ahead and you look back. Oh, let me go back. Or pretty soon they're up there and you're like, whoa, wait a minute, I'm not quite ready for that.
So there's a process, is what I'm hearing. There's a process to, you have your expectation, but the reality is that they're not there yet. And so, and sometimes the expectation can be unrealistic, but let's assuming it is realistic, then there is this growth process to get there.
Right.
And so that's very, very good, David. Very good. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for sharing. We appreciate that. And thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you next time. And in the meantime, have an epic day in the Lord.